Welcome. It's a nice snowy day here in Connecticut. The sunlight on the snow is really gorgeous, and I'm looking forward to painting some sort of a warm scene. I did a wash, and I waited for that wash to speak to me. And give me some idea of what I would put on that wash. So I made a sketch of some mountains. I decided that the horizon line would be right about here. And I measured up exactly so that I would have a straight horizon line, because there's nothing more disconcerting at the end of painting to realize that you've made your horizon crooked and slanted. So the horizon line is always exactly straight. And so I just measured up with my ruler from the bottom of the paper, in this case 7 inches, to make this line here lightly. And then of course one can see things above the horizon line, but the water, that is this body here, will not be above the horizon line in the painting anyway. So I don't know the science of all that, but it's important to at least have that line straight. So one of the things that I did was to draw in some distant mountains, showing the water here. I thought I would make the shoreline similar to what one sees along the Hudson River in New York State, with some big grayish granite rocks and some boulders. We also have that kind of big boulder stones here in Connecticut and some of our lakes, our local lakes. So I thought I would do that first. And so I'll begin with, some soft violets in the background, in the furthermost. Oh, my puppies are not cooperating with my desire to do this video. Quiet down, you guys. I know you're just playing. Yeah, hopefully I closed the door, but I have to keep my eye on them because they're only 4 months old, and so I'm going to make a little bit of, there's some shadow there. I don't really want shadow on the painting. I'm going to make a little bit of cobalt violet to start. And take also a little bit of cobalt blue and mix some of that over here. Put those two colors there side by side. And I'm going to drop them, side by side. Yeah, that's probably enough color. And I keep my reds and violets on one palette and my blues and greens on another, and that way I don't worry about them blending together a little bit from one part of the palette to the other. Just to give you an idea, here's the blue and green palette with various dabs of colors. Some dabs are about 10 years old, but others are freshened up or new. So I'll begin by the furthermost mountain. And I'm not going to make it too rounded. I want it to have some diversity in its shape. But I'm just going to lightly indicate that. And just soften the edge a little bit with rinsing my brush, and there, just softening that edge a little bit, and then down toward the bottom of the mountain, dropping in a little bit of the cobalt blue into that cobalt violet, so that it's a little slightly bluer and darker as it goes toward the mountain below. Okay, so that's one. And that cobalt blue, I'll do it again, and with again the cobalt violet, the two together, and I'll put a little bit of sap green over here. I'll show you the sap green. So I'll put a little bit of sap green in that blue and drop that into the cobalt violet, and so that I differentiate the mountain that's a little bit closer. It's really a hill more than a mountain, a little bit closer. Mixture of the violet and the sap green and some water, and there, and just as I did before, I'll take a little bit of cobalt blue and intensify the color as it gets closer to the hill that is more in the foreground, just to distinguish between one and the other. And I'll drop a little bit more in here, up here too. And then again, like I did before, I will soften the edge a little bit with just some a cleaned brush in the water, and soften the edge so that it's not a hard edge. Okay. So I'm choosing to work on one area. Again, there's a mountain behind that's very far, is over here. And I'm leaving that nice orange in there. I'm not scrubbing it out. I'm just painting over it with the cobalt violet. And it creates a slightly different look than the one here that was where the wash was pink and yellow rather than violet. So I'm just putting some color over there. And that let some of that orange color show through, and also to some extent indicates that there was reflection from the sunset or sunrise. I'm not distinguishing which it is, whether it's sunrise or sunset at this point. I think more a sunset probably, but it doesn't really matter. The viewer can decide. This is an imagined landscape that is basically following what the wash spoke to me and said, okay, let's do this with this wash. It could have been an ocean scene, a sailing scene, any number of things, but that's what I'm doing there. And again, I want a little bit of a variation here on the edge and a soft edge. Okay, I'll go back over to this side and make it a little more intense. I'll be mostly mixing that green and that blue together rather than the violet, and making this hill in front a mixture of blue and green. I could add a little bit of an olive green to that too. Not too much though, just a little bit. And of course the wash below does have an impact on the color, which is fine. I'm leaving a little separation for the moment between the two colors. I don't want them to really bleed together because those are different hillsides and they are separated, and to some extent the light may create a little bit of bright light on the top of them. And I'll take a little bit of that cobalt and then down near the shore, let that bleed in here. So it's a little darker there. And then just take my clean brush, damp, not too wet, blend it a little bit, soften some of the edges, let some blending happen, but leave some of those light spots. So, and then that begins to define a rock that is part of the shoreline here and sticking out. And there's another big one, great big granite cliffside there. Okay, now travel over to the other side and use, since about the same distance from the viewer, more or less the same blue and green mixture. And let those two colors blend together there. And I haven't quite decided what color to make that little hillside in the center. It's very far off, so it should be lighter and maybe a little more violet. I'm going to drop some cobalt blue down on the base of this, like I did in the other one. It just had the base be a little more connected to the earth, a little darker. Also because the light is coming from behind, what's down at the base of these hills is a little more in shadow than what's at the top of these hills. This is just a beginning. You can always go in and touch up some of these later. Touch up this lavender hill with a little bit more lavender, of the cobalt violet rather. Yeah, I like a little more definition on that one. The thing is to make each one of these hills a little different. They're all a slightly different distance from the viewer, so they will each be a little different. Now as this has been drying, it's a little lighter here on this front one, so I'm going to just make it a little more dark with a bit more cobalt violet to distinguish it from the one that's a little more behind. It is a colorful hillside, but the way the eye sees the colors, when they all blend together later, that'll work out pretty well. Here, I think what I'm going to do there is take a Payne's Gray, and mix a little cobalt violet with that Payne's gray, so it has less color in it than the ones on the side, and be more subtle in the distance. I hear you, puppies. I gotta always keep my eye on them because sometimes they do something really naughty when you're not listening and paying attention to them. They're only 4 months old, so. Yeah, so that's a beginning there. Okay, now really that needs to dry before I do these ones in the front. So I thought what I would do next, first I'll wipe my mixing tray, which is just the cover of these palettes. Wipe that and clean it, and just show you how I approach creating a little more cloud in the sky. So we've got the basic color of the sky, and I'm just going to take a bit of, let's see, which one will I use? Yeah, I'll use some rose madder. Rose madder. Put that here. It's a subtle rose. It's not bright like opera rose, which is very bright, almost neon. I'm going to take that rose madder and add a little bit of cobalt blue to that. Make it a little more rose. Yeah, that seems like a pretty good color to me. And I'm just going to indicate cloud, the bottoms of some clouds. Softly indicate the bottoms of some clouds. I mean, normally when I do a sky, I just paint in the clouds and leave some white paper, but this was washed on ahead of time, and so it's not the same kind of approach. But every time you do it, you should feel free that it can be a little bit different each time. And so this time I'll add a little bit of a lighter pink up here on the top. This is a little bit of opera rose on the top. It's very bright, but the colors always dry a bit lighter, so I think that it'll work out and not be too intense. A lot of times the clouds there are so many different shapes of clouds, but I'm assuming that these are going to be the ones that are a little bit flat on the bottom. And then I can put a little bit of darker color. This is the Payne's gray. Just drop a little bit of Payne's gray into the bottom and let that just bleed up. So this is like when the sun is setting and the clouds start to get more dark as it moves away from the setting sun. So I have a little more Payne's gray also as we go further away. This is that nighttime kind of feeling, and I'm blending a little bit of that night color in there. That's basically glazing over. with a little bit of Payne's Gray to make some of that nighttime feeling, leaving some spaces. And since I'm just making this up, of course I could not have it be as good as it should be if I were doing plein air perhaps. But I like the enjoyment of just following the wash, and so I'm dropping in some little more opera rose near the edge of where that sun is setting. Blend a little bit of that in as if some clouds are covering that yellow a little bit. And I'll put a little bit of that mixture I made of cobalt and blue. There. So I'm going to let that dry rather than take the chance of overworking it. But I will just take a paper towel and clean my brush. I have a very big bucket, more than a gallon of water over there, so that I don't have to run and change my water all the time, because that's really a very big bucket. That way it keeps it pretty clean. So that's one side. We'll do something similar on the other side. Again, I'll just do a little bit of Payne's Gray underneath, and a little bit of the cobalt violet mixed with blue above, and there'll be some clouds coming across the sunset a little bit, not too much, just here and there. And I'll make some sense of clouds up here. And this is just very subtle. Some more water in this here, so it lets the color below show through. Some color over here also, as if there are more clouds showing through. Very transparently going across the light in some places. A little bit of rose madder here and there, just dropping it in. Drop some in over here. I'll also drop some in over here at the base of the mountain, at the top of the mountain. So there are no rules, it's just you try to get a feeling for it. Usually with a sunset, the color moves from white light, where the sun is, to yellow, to orange, and then eventually more violets. And the violets get darker as you go away from the sunlight. So I'm going to do a range of different, I don't want these clouds to be too perfectly formed. They should just be indicative. They shouldn't be like they're sculptures up in the sky. Just this has got a little bit too formed there. And a little more opera rose in here, dropped in here and there. Not too much. And a little bit more Payne's Gray down here. So, and I'm trying to also make sure that I distinguish between the top of the mountain and the sky, so that we don't want a hard edge, but we want to see the sky is darker away from the light, you can still see just slightly the edge of the mountain. Take away from the edge of the mountain. So I think that's a good start to the sky. I dropped a little color there. Yeah. Now, I don't want to go into this mess here, which is going to be evergreens, and have it mess up in that space of the sky. So I'm just going to begin to show some of the granite boulders and define them a little bit, just using the Payne's gray. It'll be more in shadow as they move away from them, and there'll be gray boulders. So I'm just going to define it a little bit here and there. Not too much to start, just to indicate it. And then there will be some of the color of the sunset reflecting on them, but then as they move away from the sun, there'll be more in the dark. So we'll put in the middle value first, and then we can come back and put in the darker values later. But I just want to start the definition of this scene. Start some of these boulders here in the way that they're going to be. And then in here, in this area, that will all be evergreen forest. So here's another big boulder here. It's like a cliffside of granite. And then there's some more stones here. And some coming out, some coming out. And I'm just vaguely indicating them where I've already put some pencil marks. And the pencil marks were where I thought what would be a nice balance of, you don't want them looking like a stone wall, but just a diverse collection of stones here. And it doesn't matter that the reddish color shows through. As you thicken your watercolor, it will cover up the underlying color pretty well. But since, but it's quite okay that some of that soft red shows through, because it is reflecting the sunlight. So I like to just stand back every now and then and look at that. There are going to be some boulders over here. This is an area of ground that is going to be close to the viewer and in the foreground, and that will be a field of grasses and bushes, so it'll be more golden in color. But there'll be some stones down by the shoreline that we can see. But in this area, I will create some brushy marks and grassy marks to show that it's foreground. But I'll just put a little bit of indication of that there'll be some stones down there by the water. So it's like the viewer is on a hillside here, looking out at the water. Now, I still want to leave all that forest for the next stage later, but one of the things I can do now that I feel comfortable to do is indicate the water a little bit more than it is here. So I'll take, I think I'll take some of this, it's like a manganese blue. It's sort of a greenish manganese blue. And I'm going to put some of that color on in a limited way here and there over the reddish and orange colors. And they show through, so it blends in. You don't really quite see it as a blue, so it becomes more of a violet. But in some places you will get the sense that it's blue, and in other places it will look a little less blue because of the underlying color. And it's also, basically the water always is reflecting the sky. But I just want to indicate with some horizontal lines, and they have to be, they do have to be horizontal, they can't be at an angle. Because again, the water's coming down toward the viewer, and the lines that we see here should be horizontal. We don't want a lot of them, but we want some of them. Especially here in the center, we want a little bit. And it'll look more blue here in the center than it does. But we don't want too much because there is a big bright light on the water. And where it's going over yellow, it looks a little more of a greenish hue. When the blue is going over the the rose madder or the orange, it takes on a more of a violet hue. Yeah, good. But the idea is just to give a little more indication of it being a smooth plane of water. And I'll do the same thing over here. Not as much, but some. Because this is further to the left of the viewer, who's more or less in the center here. And so I don't want it to be as detailed. Later on I may add some more, but it's important to kind of let it dry because watercolor often dries to about half the darkness of when you put it down. So it's important to just let it dry, especially if it's very watery, it'll dry to be much lighter. But if you put it on thick, with less water, then it won't change as much. But in general, the consistency that I'm working with here, I would say it would go about half. All right, that's a good start. I'll put a little bit of that same blue. And I could have chosen any blue, frankly. I just decided to go with the kind of manganese or cerulean blue that's a little brighter and a little more greenish, because water often has a greenish cast to it anyway because of all the plant life in it and all the greenery all around it. So. Okay. All right, that's it. Oh, I hear my dogs barking outside. So I'm going to take a break and work on this again with you in another stage, okay? This is to be continued, but we'll stop here for now. Thanks. Hello everyone. I'm ready to move on to the areas of the evergreen, and I'm just going to put my paper towel in the water and reduce the color a little bit because it is very bright. And when I did this wash, I thought I would be just creating an ocean scene, but then after I looked at it, I thought, well, I think I'd like to do some evergreens in addition to water. So I'm just going to remove a little bit of color. So that the green will not become completely brown. Unfortunately, when you have a lot of pink and red and orange, and then you try to do green as a glaze over that, it becomes brown. And so I don't really want brown there, but I like to have, I'm happy that I made this wash, and I can lightly, I'm not scrubbing. I wouldn't say this is scrubbing. When I scrub, I often use like a scrub brush. I did a little scrubbing here to make it whiter, but with a scrub brush. Okay, so this though, I don't want to do too much there. I don't really want to lighten the water too much. Maybe just a little bit. It's kind of bright. Okay, so what I'm going to do, since when you mix pink or red with green, you get brown. Especially if I use one of the more olive greens, then I would get a very muddy kind of brown. If I mix the pink with blue, I'll get a violet. What I want to do, I think, is pick a green that is very bright. And so I think what I'm going to do is pick this. I could either pick this very bright apple green, which is a little too bright, I think, or I could pick this phthalo green. Yeah, that's more of an evergreen color. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put at this point, so this is going to be a short segment of the video because it has to all dry. I'm just going to put a wash of the phthalo green over this area. And then after that is dry, then I'll work on some of the detail of the evergreen trees in that area. But for now, I just want to put in a very first wash, and it's a fairly watery wash. And this phthalo green is somewhat transparent, so you can see the color below. You can see a bit of that rose color below. Has a really nice glow to it, and I'm happy to have that. I'm not going to try to get rid of that. You'll notice that I'm not using any opaque colors, no cadmium colors, and no really opaque colors. The cobalt blue is slightly opaque, but not totally opaque. Most of my colors are all very transparent. This phthalo green is very transparent, but just so you are aware of it, I rarely use it because it is a staining color. And you saw me lift that pink that I had put on here, and that is not a staining color, but this phthalo blue is a staining color, so if I wanted to lift that out of the paper, I really wouldn't be able to. And now the other thing that I want to do is make another wash for the foreground, which is going to be a very lemony. Since I have a pink there, I'm going to put on a very lemony yellow, and that will make a bit of a soft orange kind of color. Whereas if I just put on a more like an Indian yellow, it would be too orangey, but this is a nice one. Okay, so I'm not going to put that in very much, but here and there I might even put a little bit of this lemon yellow in a few spots. Okay, that's all I will do for now. I will let this rest until it's completely dry before going to the next phase. I'll just hold it up for you so that you might be able to see it a little bit better. So I know it's not easy to see with the camera. On the side of me, but unfortunately I don't have a setup where I can put the camera above, and so I put the camera right to the side of me where I can't knock it over. And these mountains, I'll do a little more on those mountains later, but right now they're a good level of wash, not too heavy. So only the sky now is pretty well finished, and the other areas are still very much light washes, so I can do a lot of detail still in these areas at the next phase. Until the next phase, I'll connect to you then. Take care. Bye-bye. Okay, Good morning. I'm just going to do a little trial of some colors in my evergreen area. I'm going to work with some blues. And some greens. I laid down, as you know, there was an earlier wash of the background colors of yellow, rose, and orange. And I had no intention of what that would become when I did the wash, but after I looked at it, I thought, well, I'll make this wash into a scene of a big river like the Housatonic River that has the beautiful granite. So what I want to do along its sides, but the wash was a little too pink, and so I thought, well, what color might tone it down to be the base for the evergreens? And I looked at my palette and chose this very bright phthalo blue, which is staining. I'll put a little on. Well, it looks like my dogs are settling down a little bit. I tried out that color on both sides a little bit, so I kind of like it. I'm going to continue so that you can see what I've done. I took some cobalt blue, which is a very nice transparent non-staining and slightly granulating color, and put that down lightly in a wash, not a wash really, a scrumbling in an uneven way, not totally covering the colors below, letting some of them glow through, So there's a diversity of transparency to the underlying colors. This is already dried. I took my hair dryer and dried it a little bit there. And I like the vibrancy of the phthalo green, and I'm just going to, which I put as a very transparent thin wash below over the pink. And I'm just going to drop a little bit of that in for variance. I think you can see, I hope you can see the colors pretty well with this lighting. And then a tiny bit of, little bit darker ultramarine blue here and there, which is the granulating color. A little bit closer to the background, and in places where there'll be some differences in the foreground here. This will be in a lot of shadow here, over here, away from the light. So I'll carry that darker ultramarine in here in more places, and a little heavier. I'm going to add some water to spread it, and I'm making some marks that are a little bit like evergreens with some points here and there, just to have some of those slight indications, but not too emphasized. And again, I'm going to just drop in a little bit of that phthalo green, because the contrast of the vibrancy of that is kind of nice. I like the way it dried in here. Okay, and I also dropping in a little bit of Payne's Gray, which is very dark, but I want some places where that will blend into the wash. I might do some accents with that later, but for now I just want some, since I want it to blend in a little bit and darken some of these colors here, but not too much because it'll make it very dark and muddy. And just take some water and blend that down into the shadow area. You can see the Payne's Gray when it's got water in it, more transparent. And I'm just being very careful with this, because this is going to be, all this evergreen is going to be a large part of this background, and if I overdo it, it'll just ruin the whole possibility of this painting. A little more Payne's Gray in here in the wash. And I'm just going to soften the edges and decide how I want it to connect to the rocks below in a little while later after it dries. But normally there would be, at the base of the trees, there'll be areas of darker shadow that'll happen at the base of the trees, under the trees, and above the rocks. So I'm just going to slightly indicate that now and draw some of that color up into the wash above. Leaving some edges too where the rocks will be. So this is how I'm going to build up this whole hillside, slowly, slowly. with a range of a bright green in this second. This is actually the third wash. The first wash was the original base coat of pinks and yellows. And then the second wash was a very thin wash of phthalo green. There's a little more phthalo green here and there and more toward the sunlight. And it's very bright, so I don't want to do too much of it. And then this third wash has some blues, a touch of phthalo green, and some Payne's gray. There. So the shadow of the light will be away from the light, so this will be more in shadow on the sides, but the reflection will come down to you as the viewer, straight toward you as the viewer. So we'll do the same over here, just taking that transparent phthalo blue, which I would normally never use for a shadow color, but since I'm putting it over pink, it tones it down to a different shade, and it's not so bright. So it still gives us the sense of green, which if I put a more olive green or earthy green color, it might be a little too dull and come out as brown on the over the pink. So I'm just putting this phthalo green in for now, a very subtle indication of the reflection of the evergreens coming down toward the viewer. And I'm not making them ripply because actually some of the, I'll do a little bit, but not too much. Some of the ripples that I did below in blue are already coming through in these reflections. So I just do a little tiny bit to indicate again the water's movement. It's a large body of water, so there's just soft. And it's a calm day. I indicate it's a calm day in this scene. So the ripples are just calm. Okay, it's very subtle at this point because we're using the glazing method of painting. We have lots of opportunity to come back later and put in some strong, more intense colors, which I will likely do at the very base of this reflection, where the rocks are joining the water. I'll put a more intense reflection, just like I put up here a little more intense shadow under the trees, where there are spaces in the branches and the trunks are coming down and meeting the stones. Okay. So that's just enough for now. Let this completely dry. It will, of course, dry much later. So we'll see what it does. Put a little more dark up here, because I want lost edges, but not so much that it's just a big muddy blur up there right now. And I can always come in and put a little more detail in later. This one's a little better, not so muddy. Not so, I mean, not muddy, but yeah, muddy, a little bit muddy there. While those colors in the water and above are drying, and I'm going to take some other colors that I have in my little arsenal. One color that I always have available is titanium white. Doesn't matter really which brand, in a gouache. Titanium white is a pretty transparent white in watercolor, and sometimes I might use it, but it doesn't really do much of a job to give you a white on the paper. You have to use it very, very sparingly because it is very opaque, and if you don't handle it carefully, it will you can see I'm using my pliers to open up the paint. And the pliers are, I can also just run over to my sink and put it under hot water. I have here in my arsenal a titanium white in gouache, and then in watercolor from Daniel Smith, I have a buff titanium, which is a very light beige, so that's a watercolor. And this is also a watercolor, not a gouache. And this is called Sag Harbor Gray. Now, what I'm going to do is use these colors to do my stones. Normally I don't, you can see that I don't use these very much because they don't open very easily, so they've been around, hanging around for a while, ready to do a job. But I think in the case of these stones, since I did have that very bright pink, of course I could have started with a blank canvas and then I wouldn't have had to deal with all these bright pinks, but then we wouldn't learn about some of that, how one deals with making color corrections and paint corrections. So this, you can see, this is the Sag Harbor Gray. It's a very nice, soft color that's good for the stone. And this is the buff titanium. It's kind of similar to the Sag Harbor Gray, slightly different, but not very much, a little more brownish. And then here, of course, just the plain white in gouache. Now, I could have, if you don't have these colors in your arsenal, you could have created a gray by taking the Payne's Gray and my Payne's Gray has a slight bluish cast to it. In fact, I might add a little bit of cobalt, make it a little more bluish, and add a little bit of burnt sienna, making it a little more neutral. Okay, and then I could just take some normal white that is not a gouache. Chinese white. I can use some Chinese white or some zinc white. Zinc white is very bright and that's a nice white color. I could take some of that white and I could make a gray with that white. And that's another way to do this. So I can either buy colors, some Sag Harbor gray. Here, look at, there's a nice gray too. Or I can make a gray, and I can have that gouache there if I want some white highlights. The reason I'm doing this is that I'm going to start with the watercolors. And use these light colors, which are all a little bit opaque, to put some light colors over the pink. And I'm gonna vary them, mix them. They don't have to all, I mean, it's stone, and stone will be varied. I'm just going to put some there in an initial wash to show some of these cliffside stones. Covering up some of that pink. And just putting in an initial where I had drawn the stones, putting in some color that is toning down the pinks in those areas. Mostly right now I'm just focusing on a base for the stones, and I'll decide later how to detail the stones, but I don't want that bright pink base. Some of it will come through. And that's okay, as if it was reflecting the sky color anyway. One would have some pink coming through. So I'm not going to be worrying about making a big solid blob of base, but I just want to tone down that pink initially and get my stones started. And I'm not using any of the gouache at this point, because that's the last thing to put down if I decide I want some highlights in white. But I'm just going around here using the watercolor of these different colors, the buff titanium and the Sag Harbor. That Sag Harbor blue is from American Journey. Yeah, it's from American Journey. Whereas the buff titanium is from Daniel Smith. And the gouache that I happen to be using right here, I'm not using it yet. That's Winsor Newton, my Chinese white that I mixed in with my blues and burnt siennas to make a neutral, and then added the Chinese white to make it, I'm using that more than the others. These are all Winsor Newton, these are all Daniel Smith colors. But Winsor Newton and Daniel Smith are very comparable professional grade colors, and mostly I use them. Sometimes I use the Sennelier because I love some of their colors, and also they mix their paints in the old way with honey. It gives a little different behavior and character. So you can see that pink is very strong, and it's going to keep coming through. Yeah. I could say, yeah, it wasn't the smartest thing to try to do this painting over that pink background, but at the same time, I'm kind of enjoying the paint cast that it creates to the whole painting. And after all, it's only a piece of paper, and we paint and learn every time with a new painting. We learn something new, we try something new, and we learn something new. There's really, from my point of view, I mean, one could always do the same thing and create perfect results every time by knowing exactly how that will work. But there's no learning process there, and so I like the experimentation. All right, so that's just the beginning of the stones, and this is a good point at which to break. I'm going to take a perylene green. Just show you it here, this perylene green. It's a very dark green, and I think it's a pretty good one for my next step. I consulted my color dots, and here's the perylene green here. Just wanted to check. It's not a granulating color. It's semi-transparent, and it's medium staining. But I like the color, and I wanted to give it a try on here for this, because it's a it's a good solid dark, and I wanted to use that rather than using black at this point, or making a bluish neutral with brown and blue. So I'm going to put in some accents using the perylene green to just give some sense of tree accents. Since it's semi-transparent, it will show colors through anything that is applied with a fair amount of water. I'm adding water in some places and minimizing it in others, so it's varied. It will tone down some of these very bright colors that I have here. I like the bright colors in the previous washes, but at the same time, now that they're there, I can choose to tone down some of them and leave others. And so rather than put in a Payne's gray or a black in some of these shadow areas, I'm going to use this perylene green, and behind some of these rocks. It's a nice almost black green, very lovely, and yet it will keep the tone, a tone of slight green. I really highly recommend that everybody who studies with me get the color dots because it allows you to, for a very low cost, it's a tremendous amount of paint that Daniel Smith gives you. Winsor Newton also has a package of color dots. I think that the range of colors available from Daniel Smith is quite significant. So, I mean, 238 color dots, which, so it's about 10 cents per dot, which to me is really well worth it for the $23 of the color dots. And under each dot it tells you whether it's light fast, whether it will fade over time, as rated by the American Standard Testing methods. So that's ASTM rated. It will tell you each whether the tube is light fast or not, which is important because if you use colors that are rated well for light fast knitting, then they will not fade over time. So I'm just putting in now some of those details and shadows behind here, behind the rocks, at the base of the trees, and between some of the trees. I'm not going to do them all because I like the idea of things drying and me kind of sleeping on the painting a little bit, looking at it in different times of day, like early morning light. I mean, right now I'm painting under some extremely bright lamps, and of course that's not the same as natural light, and but I need that for the video purposes. But I need to look at it in natural sunlight, and also in my room when it's a little darker in the evenings, and I should hold it upside down sometimes in front of a mirror to see about the balance of the and since I want the water to also, near the rocks, have a little bit of greenish tone. It often does because of the vegetation in the water. So I'm going to use this perylene green also at the base of the rocks, and with some water, carry some of that down into the reflection, rather than using any other color at this point. And that green, as I mentioned, when it mixes with the rose, gets further toned down, slightly more brownish. When you mix green and red together, you get a brown. So green and yellow and red basically make brown. So I'm just ever so carefully using that to begin to define those rocks that I place some color around. In these rocks I placed the three colors that I showed you, the buff titanium and the Sag Harbor blue, and the color I mixed with Chinese white. Now this perylene green is not a granulating color. It is not a granulating color. Some of the greens granulate. We get granulation when we mix, most of the browns granulate, so that's why I'm not putting in the grounds at this point. All these colors are pretty much non-granulating and basically either transparent or semi-transparent. The only colors here that are opaque and not transparent are those stone colors that I used, and I did that deliberately in order to really cover up the pink a bit in the stone areas. Only the opaque colors are so able to cover, but they do change the glow of the paper a bit, and I tend not to use opaque colors very much, and only for small areas, because they can be a bit of a distraction. When you take away the glow of the paper in an area, it is actually pretty noticeable. in certain light. There is one watercolor society, the Transparent Watercolor Society, where you're not supposed to use anything opaque, and they will go around when there are entries and check them to make sure that they are actually fully transparent watercolor. So for that one particular show, one has to be careful. But for all the watercolor societies, they are attentive to any distraction that happens. If you're not careful with the opaque colors. I'm leaving a little bit of that pink, but I'm beginning to just outline. Now I'll do the same thing on the other side. So let's see, I don't want to do too much, but I'll do a tiny little bit up here. Not all the way to the edge, because I've got a soft edge there. I'm going to leave that soft edge. But just a tiny bit. Okay, so you can see how I'm doing that. And put a little bit here at the base of this one. Little tiny bit, not continuous lines. I don't want continuous lines, just marks here and there. And then if I take my rigger brush, here's one of my rigger brushes. This one's a Princeton, very affordable, made in India. It's also called a liner brush. And I'll make some subtle tree marks, like branches sticking up. And I'm going to use the same Pearlian green for that, rather than a black. It's a little softer than a black, and it blends in here with the evergreens very nicely. So I'm going to put as if some branches are coming out from some trees. And some of them will be a little bit sideways. You know, somehow when you look at the greens, you'll see some branches coming out to the side. Very subtle. And I use my rigger for that. Very light, very, very subtle. You can do that better with the liner brush or the rigger brush than with anything else. And if you have this color, I'm not using it, and it's got a fair amount of water in the color, but not too much. So I'm able to get a mark, but it's not a heavy mark. I don't want it to be a distraction, but I might make a few a little more dark with less water in order to just indicate maybe that's a trunk of a tree. No, I don't want that. Okay, I think that I can always revisit that a little bit, but I'll make a very slight mark here to indicate the edge of that rock. Some crevices in the rock. And as I said, I'm not using any reference photo here, so I'm just making that up. And in the reflection, I can have also a little bit of marks. You know, there will always be some marks that will come down and be a little more noticeable than others, very subtly, to indicate some branches and some trees. Just an indication in the reflection coming toward the viewer. Okay. I will do the same thing on the other side, so I don't need to show it to you right now. You'll see it after it's finished. But that's my approach for that. In this area here, I will do a little bit in that blue color here to break it up a little bit with some dots of the evergreen, and again breaking that up a little bit, a little more texture with the evergreen, bringing in just some dots and a little tiny bit of squiggles with the but not too much detail because it would really be a distraction. Tiny bit here. Just to get the sense of trees sticking up in front of that mountain, and then carrying that forward a little bit with some dots. Okay, I think that side is pretty close to being ready, and I'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay, as I had said I would, I continued the colors with the perylene green in creating some dark accents. It looks almost black, but the green goes well with the rose, creating a little brownish slightly. It's a semi-transparent green, so it still allows, in the places where it's done lightly with more water, it allows some of the rose color to come through. When I apply it more densely, it is holding its color. It's semi-transparent, so it's not opaque, but it creates a certain amount of opacity, so as semi-transparent. Now over here I've done the same thing, carrying the reflections down in the same way. You'll notice that reflections are smaller when the image is further away. It makes sense that the reflections wouldn't be as long because it's further away. So these are shorter, these are longer. These are shorter, these are longer, but they're not as long as over here because this is closer. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do was darken my sky. And so I came over here and I put some of this perylene violet in here and blended it forward, and did the same thing over here. Put some water down first is what I did, a little bit of water, and I dropped the color in and let it blend. Now the perylene violet is one of the popular violets of colorists because it is a completely transparent violet, which means it will allow the color below to show through. It's very good for glazing. So what I'm going to do the same thing over here that I did here, which is I glazed over the dried color that was below the darkened sky. And I did that same thing over here. It created, because the sky is darker there, then the water and the hillside also will be darker. Remember, this is an imagined landscape, but because it's imagined, I still have to think, how would it be in nature? And then I will just blend that out with water. I want it blended. I don't want it to have any hard edges there with that brush stroke. But putting on a dark shadow, whether it's a portrait that you're using the glazing technique with, or it's a landscape, that is done in the last step. Of course, you have the potential to make a big mess and ruin it. But you can see here I'm applying it with some water very lightly and blending it in. And I had let the layers below completely dry so that they would not, and by not using too much water, I didn't reconstitute the paint in the layers below. So if you act with a light touch and just add, and not too much water, that will dry fairly quickly and blend nicely. And so that will create the shadow as if this darkened sky above is creating that shadow, and it's the same violet. And as I said, it's in a perylene violet, which is a transparent, a totally transparent paint. Okay, you may remember that I put some white gouache on the mixing tray. So just move that over there, out of the way. It's at this point that I'd like to take that gouache and make what we call marks in watercolor. Just make some marks. A fairly thick application of it. The gouache is opaque, and so you don't want to do a lot of opaque color on the watercolor because it always draws the eye because of its opacity. So, but nevertheless, if you were doing daisies in a field, for example, you might use the cadmium yellow, which is opaque, and an opaque white watercolor or a gouache. I like to use the gouache because it really leaves a bright mark, and I can rely on it not becoming transparent and letting color below show through. And want the stones to be there. Have some sharp edges. I think that's doing pretty well. Now I don't need to do any white in the water, but I'll just show you I could do a little bit of white. my rigger. And do a little bit of white lines in the water to just emphasize the water. And I don't think it'll take too much away from the water to do that. And then a little more down here. And just do a little tiny bit here and there. And I'm not the only watercolorist who will put a little white in at the last minute. Oftentimes, Alvaro Castaget will put his paintbrush right inside the tube to make some marks. They just catch the light a little different. And I wouldn't normally need that. I don't really need them in this part here. But I'm going to put them in since I have some opacity in the stones here. I prefer to have it not just there, but carried forward in a few other places so that there is some opacity in other parts of the painting. And other than this area here, I think all of this area now is done. Pretty well done. I'm going to let it dry and see how it does. And then this area here. Oh, by the way, one thing I did do off camera, and I will show you what I did. I took that Paraline and I'll show you, put my toothbrush in it, okay, and I just flicked some speckles over into this mountainside, and some speckles over into this mountainside. It just creates a little bit of texture. There. Add a little bit of texture. And then one of the things I could do, just to show you, sometimes it's a good idea to do something with alizarin crimson. It's a wonderful, wonderful red, extremely vibrant, can be partially staining and also partially granulating. But when you want to create a little pop, because there could be little bits of color in there, that against the green, I like it. That one's a little bit too much, but let me take a little bit out and leave some. A little bit out while it's still there, but because I put too much water under the brush, but there. Well, I'm ready to finish up. I was going to do this all kind of light and with golden bushes and things, but I looked at it and decided I wanted to have some stones to mirror the stones in the background. So I had this nice painting, which I like a lot. It's a painting that I have that I've done. It's another imagined landscape, but always taking images that I photograph of details to remind myself what should be in the painting in terms of the nature of those things. And so, in fact, I just came in. I've got my walls, I don't know if you can't see it, my walls overalls on over my indoor flannel shirt, and also a fleece jacket. So I've got my walls on. I just came in from feeding the horses. So what I want to do is create some stone details here in the foreground that have a little more detail than the ones in the back, but some of the same colors. I'm going to start though with a very intense Payne's gray and make a detailed shadow. I've already sketched the stones, and since it's a little pile of outcropping, I just wanted to remind myself of some of the stones that I've seen. I'm always photographing stones out on the trails. We have a lot of trails here in Roxbury with beautiful outcroppings, and I'm always taking pictures of them. And just now, it's snowing out, so I just went out to take pictures of how the snow looks in front of banks of hemlocks and marsh trees and evergreens, tall evergreen pines, for some snow scene that we're going to be painting. A couple of days ago we had some snow on the ground and some very bright light, so it was a good time to take photographs of the shadows and just to capture and document some of the shadows. I do that all the time whenever there's special light and different weather conditions, to remind myself. Okay, so that's the beginning of the darkest shadows on the stones, just want to create some diversity in these outcroppings as they pop out of the ground. And I've got some down here closer to the shore. Again, some diversity. Sharp edges, some sharp edges with my thing here. And now I'm going to take some, we often mix together, as I have said before, and I'm boring you with it, but we often mix together burnt sienna or burnt umber, either one, or both. I'll take both just to show you the difference on my palette here, my mixing tray. A slight difference in the, here, burnt umber, slight difference in hue. But I want to take those two and mix them with ultramarine blue, which is a granulating blue, but a transparent blue. These two, burnt sienna, burnt umber, are also granulating. And so I'm going to make them more on the blue side than and that makes a nice neutral. And of course, the more water you add to it, the more it becomes a light gray. So I'm not going to put any opaque in this. I'm just going to make some lighter tones. Still too dark. some lighter tones on the stone. I could use some of that same color that I used on the other stones, and I might throw some of that in, but since it's opaque I can add it later. So I'm just creating some characteristics in the stones, different shapes and text, and some granulating texture will come from the and in honor of Roxanne, who's in our painting class and who's a piano teacher, I've got some classical piano sonatas in the background. I used to try to play the piano myself, but I was never very good at it. In my youth, I played the accordion, and I got good enough to be on the Ted Mack show on television. Those of you who are old like me, you may remember the Ted Mack show. So I actually managed to be on the Ted Mack show, and I used to, do stuff in school concerts and things, and I was a member of a band. So I played the accordion for about, I would say about 6 to 8 years. But the good thing about that, the really good thing about that, is nothing teaches you how to prepare to be an artist better than the rigor of doing hourly practice, at least every day, of scales, to learn how to have hand-to-eye coordination, where you're looking at the music and your hands are moving along the keys without you having to look at them. And you just practice those scales until you've got this hand-to-eye memory and coordination that just works. And then that same concept works very well for looking at things, and while you're looking at them, having your eye be able to sketch them. So I'm going to take a little bit of that white that we had before, that white gouache. I should wait for this to dry, but I think I'll just put a little bit in now and maybe a little bit later. But on the edge, I'm going to do the same thing that was done before, where the edge is catching the light. Put a little bit of white. If I was starting this from scratch, like up here in this painting, I didn't use any white. I just left the paper white in some areas and was able to paint around that white in order to create a highlight. But since I haven't really left any white on this paper, I have to add a little bit of white in. That's all right. And the other thing I'm going to do to capture some of that harmony and relationship with the stones in the background is here and there I am going to add some of this color that this Sag Harbor gray. So it is opaque. That's all right. It'll create a certain amount of balance with the opaque and that is down here. Okay. Now, The final thing that I'm going to do, people are always asking how to draw trees, so I'm done with this. I'm done with this image, which helped to remind me how I wanted to. I'm going to take some of that perylene green again, which is practically black. It's a very blackish green, but it's transparent. So if I use a lot of water, it lets the color shine through. You remember we put some of it transparently here for reflection. But what I'm going to do now is create the trunks of some evergreen trees with just that dark color, because and I'm showing them just as dark because the trunks are in, the back side of the trunks are in shadow. And we never do anything with trees that is the same on both sides. So I'm going to put a little bit of diversity there, a little bit here, a tiny bit of leaves there, but more on this side, you see, and then a little wider as it gets closer to the tree. And just a tab on this side. On this side, nothing on the right side, but just a big bough on the left, and then a little bit just below. And this is the way I do my evergreen trees. Normally you will have a bit more growth on the sun side, so that would be normal. And also the growth would be affected by the wind. So let's do the same thing over here. Just a little bit on here. And a little discontinuous line. This tree is going to have fewer branches, because it should be very different. One should feel that it's different from the tree next to it. So I'm just taking that very dark perylene, I didn't mean to say peregrine, but perylene green, which is transparent. So if I wet some of these colors, the pink would glow through. And I will use that concept in the lower part to indicate some more. So I'm going to do this one on the right a little more transparently, a little more water in it, and indicate that maybe there are a couple of trees here, smaller ones down on the slope. So I'm just putting in some washier, more watery color that will create some background to the white reflections on the stone. And I'll carry some of that color out with a bit of water. Again, a little darker near the stone to create some background to the stone. I'm carrying the evergreen a little more washy, not a lot of lines. I can, after it dries, I can put in a little more detail, but So I'm using that same color but in a lighter way. And the same thing here, more of a wash down here. And then indicating that, so there's some of those evergreens down the slope from where the viewer is standing. Just very casually indicate that with a more washy color. Very light, not too bright, not too dark, not too distracting. But just indicate that it's there. As we look down the slope. And the same over here. I'm going to put in some evergreens below some of the stones, indicating. So some of that corner is going to get covered, which is fine. I'm going to do the same thing when I'm going to put this color in this space here and go over some of that stonework. Let it blend in with the stonework, it's okay. And then put some darker color in there, and some more stems and some indicating some pine trees, just very roughly, very casually making those marks. Every now and then making one that's a little higher than the others, maybe. And then I'm just going to carry some of this green in as if there's some just balancing out some of that rosy color there so it's not undergrowth, because I'm going to put some splattering in here. Right now I'm just scrumbling. And it doesn't have to be precise. What the viewer will decide from this what it is. So what is here in the undergrowth, it's okay. One of the things about opaque color is that it doesn't cover up very well. So you can see that I'm putting this perylene green on top of some of that, toning it down, but it's a little resistant to being blocked out because it is an opaque. That was some of that opaque Sag Harbor gray by American Journey. Now this has to dry a small amount before we can go in and put just a bit more detail. But this is an area, I'll just lightly scrumble some, as if some things are sticking up there. And take a little darker, the same color but less water. Just make some dark marks in front. This is they're small trees, or trees down further on the slope. And some darker marks here. And this is a good time to put some water in this green, make a little pool of the green in a dark way. I think you can see it. And take my old toothbrush. I've got a lot of different toothbrushes from hotels and stuff, and having traveled about 30% of the year every year for 30 years. So I'm going to take some of that and just splatter. Yeah, it creates a nice sense of diversity and texture in the front. And a very dirty finger. Yeah. Okay. The only thing I can do now at the very end is just try to, let's see, is that dry enough for me to put a little more marks on those stones. Just a little bit with that opaque gray. It's just barely dry enough, not going to, so it doesn't bleed into the other colors that I just put in. And I'll take some of that green even. There's always a little bit of green in stones. I'll take a little bit of the green too and put that in there too. And then you might remember I did some shadowing with Paraline Violet and in the sky and on the water. And so I'm going to use a little bit of that violet to just build in some more shadow here and there, and some. I'm just going to carry some of that down. Create some harmony with the mountain above and the hillside here, because I have that shadow color coming all the way down. And it's okay to lose some of the edges. Because behind the rock there will be some shadow. I just want to differentiate that shadow from the stone. I think that probably most people won't know what that is, but they'll see that there's something going on and that it has diversity in here and it doesn't have to be precise. I'm connecting these two. I think that's it. I think that basically for me, I mean, while I might tweak this here and there as I look at it in different lights of day and night, I might tweak it just a tiny bit. But I would say for the most part, this painting is 98% done. The only thing I would think of doing is with my rigger, potentially putting in these kinds of marks with the rigger, these very soft. Once everything dries, some Not behaving very well, my rigger today. There, some very soft marks. Branches, twigs, things like that. Little marks here and there. Branches without anything on them. Grasses that have dried out, and plants that have dried out in the fall. It's not clear what season this is, and that doesn't matter. I wasn't trying to convey a season, so there's no fall foliage and there's no summer foliage. It's basically evergreen woodland. So there's no real... This is really too wet for me to be doing that, but just so you can see, I'm going to create some marks. And a little more, as it starts to dry, a little more of the splatter in this area here. Yeah, just to create some marks and diversity. And really, I think, I don't think I'm wanting to do any black in those trees, even though I have a little black in some of the trees above. Maybe just a couple in the trunk areas, and in some of the more intense shadowy areas. I can do that with my rigger, just a little bit to deviate from the perylene. You can see why I have so much trouble to stop tweaking. Yeah. Yeah, just a little black here and there, so it's not, this is actually a Payne's gray or an indigo. It's a very dark bluish black. Payne's gray comes with a blue hue, in a blue hue. Also, indigo is similar, but is a slightly different tone, slightly different hue. And it's staining, I rarely use it, but I do have it on my palette. Just going to differentiate one of these boulders from the other. There. Just imply that there's some, it's not one big blob of a stone. Okay.